Okay, so just a reminder, research papers are due 2 weeks from today. That kind of sneaks up on some people, so I just like to give fair warning. I know some of you have turned it in, which is perfect. If you submitted it, but you're like, oh, I made a mistake, you can still resubmit. It's not a problem. Yeah. Yeah, my dissertation's 140 pages, so I win. Yeah. Not that it's a competition, but for me, 5 pages is like nothing. But that's why I try to put it no longer than 5 pages, because I know for some students it's like, that's a lot. Yeah. 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 I'm saying 140. I win. Okay. So we talked on Monday about the state courts, and we talked about a couple of the actors within the state court, the state attorney general, and so on. Today, we're going to talk about the problems with our state judiciary system. And we're going to, I'm going to show a video that talks about the problems with electing judges. If we have a little time at the end, we'll debate the death penalty. Yeah, that'll be fun. Okay. So, what are some of the problems we see? The crime rate has gone up, partly because of increased cartel activity on the other side of the border. Partly because there are issues with more people crossing the border. There were over 800,000 crimes committed in the state in 2017. Keep in mind, it is a very big state, so part of it's just the fact that as large as Texas is, inevitably there's going to be problems with crime. We've also seen more arrests for refusals of entry along the border. By October of 2018, Texas Border Patrol agents had arrested, refused admittance to about 60,000 people along the border. Now keep in mind, it is not illegal to request asylum. If you enter the country illegally and you request asylum, they can't just kick you back out. They're supposed to take you to a detainment facility, allow you to apply for asylum. And then if you're not granted asylum, then they can deport you. It's not illegal to ask for asylum. But if you cross the border illegally and you don't request asylum, they will kick them back across the border. If someone shows up at the border and requests asylum, under international law, they are not supposed to toss them back into Mexico. So if someone shows up at the border and says, I need to request asylum, they have to let them in, or they have to take them somewhere safe. We also have a problem with the fact that our prisons are overcrowded. We've got 138,000 prisoners. Yeah, right? We've got a lot of people in a lot of prisons. Yeah, I would imagine. Yikes. Yikes. Yeah. And it doesn't help that we've moved to a for-profit prison system in a lot of ways. I mean, some of them are decent, most of them are just there to make money. I mean, some of them are okay. Some of them are decently run, but admittedly, I mean, one of the ways they've tried to reduce some of the overcrowding is by sending nonviolent drug offenders to rehab or something like that, which would honestly probably make more sense. So we've seen an increase in plea bargaining, and they account for more than 9 out of every 10 convictions. It's a two-pronged problem. On the one hand, We don't necessarily like the idea that someone could be convicted of murder and only spend 10 years in prison. We do recognize that the prisons are overcrowded. The other problem is sometimes a defendant who may not be guilty doesn't want to take a chance on getting a longer sentence at trial, and so they'll take a plea deal and plead guilty even though they're not actually guilty. Because if someone's like, look, you can spend 10 years in jail if you plead guilty, possibly 50 if you don't, you're going to take the 10 years, right? You may not want to take your chances with the courts. It can be good on one hand because it does free up resources in the courts if people take a plea deal and you don't have to go to trial. On the other hand, sometimes someone is convinced to plead guilty, even though they may not be, because they just don't want to take that chance at trial. Another problem we see is taxes are low in Texas. That means there's not as much money for necessary services like court-appointed lawyers. Gideon B. Wainwright gives us the right to a lawyer even if we can't afford one. The problem is there's just not enough money for court-appointed lawyers. If you're a court-appointed lawyer in Hidalgo County, you get paid $40 an hour for the work you do outside of court and $70 an hour for the work you're doing inside of court, which doesn't sound bad until you take into consideration that private lawyers can charge $200 an hour. Where are you going to go? It's hard to find lawyers who are willing to be public defenders. Usually, if lawyers are first starting out, they will be public defenders for a while. But they're usually overworked, they've got too many clients, and they're not getting as much money as they would if they moved to the private sector, so eventually most of them do move on. There's also issues with the electability of judges. They're not as independent as we'd like them to be. We want them to be insulated from partisanship. They have to run in a party, right? They have to run as a Democrat, a Republican, or a Libertarian. Now, the good thing about electing a judge is that they are accountable to us. If we're not happy with their performance, we can vote them out in the next election. But that means if someone is facing a tough election, maybe they'll be harder on defendants because they want to be seen as tough on crime. So they'll crack down harder than they might if they weren't in an elected position. And they do have to run under a party affiliation. What this means most of the time is we don't know a lot about the judges. We're just voting based on party affiliation. And this happens in states where they don't run under a party affiliation. We don't know enough about them to really make an informed decision. We just go by their party. And it means judges always have to think about the next election. I just got reelected. Great. Now I have to start thinking about what happens in 2 years or 4 years or so on. So their party affiliation does tend to color their judgments. Statistically speaking, Republican judges tend to favor business interests and the wealthy. Democratic judges are more concerned with things like labor unions, poor citizens, and so on. Sometimes it's just that a defendant may get the misfortune of going before a judge who's more conservative or more liberal, and that can color what happens to them when they go through the legal process. Also, it doesn't help if you have two judges in a courthouse running for the same position. It's probably going to get a little awkward and a little contentious between the two judges. There's only so many seats on the state Supreme Court. If you've got two judges from the same court running for that one seat, it ain't going to be pretty. Okay. It's also problematic that lawyers can contribute to judicial campaigns. How do you determine if a case is really going to be heard fairly if one of the lawyers is donated to the judge? It does raise questions of impartiality. I mean, usually, of course, the rule is that you're supposed to put that to the side. The judges are human. They're going to look at that, and that may even unconsciously affect their decision making. Judges have to rely on private funding. There's no public funding for the state judiciary. And most of the funding is going to come from lawyers. 72% of funding for successful judicial races in 2003 came from attorneys. And it makes sense. You want a judge that you think will be sympathetic to your cause. If you're a prosecutor, you're going to donate to a judge who says, I'm going to crack down on crime, I'm going to be tough on defendants. If you're a defense attorney, you may donate to a judge who says, you know what, our prisons are overcrowded, maybe we can find an alternative solution, and so on. So there's a lot of issues with the role of money in our state elections. In 2006, 5 Supreme Court justices running for re-election, about 51% of their election funding came from attorneys and law firms. So again, it raises the question, how impartial can you be when lawyers are helping to determine if you get re-elected or not? They have tried to fix this a little bit. In 1996, the Judicial Campaign Fairness Act was created because a Supreme Court judge allowed a lawyer with a case he was going to hear to participate in a fundraising effort for that judge. Big conflict of interest, right? You cannot have that happening. The bad publicity that resulted made the judge recuse himself from that case. The fact that he even thought that this was okay was a problem. So now the act says a lawyer cannot donate more than $5,000 to a campaign, and law firms can't donate more than $30,000. It's still a pretty significant chunk of money, but at least it's not unlimited. And we've had people attempt to try to fix this problem. 2 consumer advocacy groups filed a lawsuit in 2000 asking for lawyers to not be allowed to donate to judicial campaigns, saying it would violate the right to a fair trial for citizens. It got taken to federal court, and the federal court judge said, this is a state issue, not federal, fix it yourselves, right? Figure it out, which isn't exactly helpful. One of the suggestions that's been made is, why don't we just make it public funding? Get rid of the special interests, get rid of the private funding. We could do this because lawyers have to pay a $200 tax every year to practice law in the state of Texas. That raises about $10 million a year. We could choose to ban private funding. We could make it public and remove this problem. Technically, lawyers would still be contributing, but they'd be contributing as a group, not as individuals. So it wouldn't have the same kind of impact that we're currently seeing. And it would also free judges up from having to take time out from deciding cases to go campaign. So it could be a win-win solution. Get rid of some of the ties between lawyers and judges, and make sure the judges are focusing on cases and not fundraising. So it's an idea. Basically, as part of their ability to practice law in Texas. They pay $200 a year to the State Bar Association to keep their license up, essentially. And then we get to the hippo in the room. I would say elephant, but that's just too political in some cases. So let's go with the hippo in the room. Obviously, the more money you have, the better a lawyer you're going to have. That's just common sense. If you can afford to pay $300 an hour for a lawyer, you're getting a damn good lawyer. If you think about it, O.J. Simpson would be in jail for killing his ex-wife and her friend if he hadn't had Johnny Cochran, right? If he couldn't afford a good lawyer, he'd be in jail right now. No freaking way, right? And we need lawyers because the legal system can be complicated. You need someone to be there to help you out during the proceedings. Be able to say you can't ask that question, or you're badgering the witness, right? It used to be the case that there weren't public defenders except for capital murder cases. So what they would do is they would use county funds to pay a private attorney to defend someone who didn't have the money otherwise. Now, of course, anytime you are arrested, you can ask for a lawyer, and one does have to be provided, period, end of sentence. So if you ever do find yourself getting arrested, the first words out of your mouth need to be, I want a lawyer, and you don't say a damn thing until your lawyer gets there. Don't make me yell at you if you don't do that. Okay. Part of the problem with public defenders, of course, is that they are way overloaded. They walk into the courthouse, grab a file from a stack of it, try to go through it quickly, say to their client, how do you want to plead? Okay, and then they disappear again. And sometimes they grab the wrong file, or sometimes they're delayed getting to court. So there's been a call to create a system where the number of public defenders would be equal to the number of prosecutors, to try and rectify that particular issue. If you have one lawyer representing 17 clients, it's going to get tricky. It's going to get complicated. And also, if you've got a prosecutor who's been practicing law for 20 years and a public defender who's fresh out of law school, it's not going to go very well for the defendant. I mean, I will give public defenders a lot of credit because they do a very difficult job as best they can, but they're outnumbered, and they know it. They know it, so they try to get their clients to take a deal so then they can get that case off their desk and move on to the next one. It's also a problem in terms of penalties. We did a study in the early 1990s and found that a white person convicted of assault in Texas had a 30% chance of getting a jail sentence. Hispanic defendants had a 66% chance of getting a jail sentence, and African American defendants had a 75% chance of getting a jail sentence. You could walk into a courtroom and you could see a Hispanic man and a white man charged with the same crime, and the sentencing may be very different. Unfortunately, it is still a problem. Minorities do disproportionately get harsher sentences compared to white defendants. And part of this is tied to the war on drugs that got really started in the Nixon administration, but became harsher in the Reagan administration. Cocaine was a problem in the US in the 1980s. There were two different types of cocaine that were common. Powder cocaine, which was common for white Americans, and crack cocaine, which was common for African Americans. Powder cocaine had a less harsh sentence compared to crack cocaine. What ended up happening? More minorities ended up in jail for longer compared to their white counterparts. Yeah, there's a really good book about this whole thing. It's called The New Jim Crow, and it talks about how African American men make up the majority of prisoners in the United States, but not the majority of the population. There's also issues with trying to fix the issues of representation. So the counties are responsible for appointing a public defender. They're supposed to do so promptly, give the lawyer quick access to their client, provide a standard of qualifications public defenders are supposed to meet, and set a fee for this public defender. The idea is, if you ask for a lawyer, you need to get one as soon as possible. You don't want to be sitting in an interrogation room for 2 hours waiting for your lawyer to show up. It can happen, but you don't want it to. Once the lawyer gets there, they are supposed to be given time to speak to their client one-on-one before they resume any questioning. Sorry? Yeah, exactly. They are supposed to be private, right? And the lawyer, because of attorney-client privilege, they're not supposed to reveal anything that the client says. Yeah, absolutely. The problem with this, of course, is it's great in theory. It's not so great in practice. The law gives 19.7 billion, give or take, in state funds every year. Sorry, 19.7 million every year to help with the $90 million the counties are spending. What ends up happening, most of the counties can't afford to pay the public defenders what they should. They're not fully complying with the law. They actually only have 2 counties who are in full compliance with the Fair Defense Act. All right, and now the other fun, interesting thing we see here in Texas, the death penalty. For a while, the death penalty was banned on the national level. In the 1970s, the Supreme Court said that the death penalty violated the Eighth Amendment. When we're looking at statistics for Texas, we have to take from 1982 on, because that was when the death penalty was allowed to resume. So from 1982 to 2019, about 560 people were executed in the state of Texas. There are 220 prisoners currently on death row in Texas. We execute the most people of any state in the U.S., which frankly is not a statistic we should be proud of, but yeah. More than 72% of our death row inmates are prisoners of color. And this is seen across the board. For a variety of reasons, statistically speaking, minority defendants are more likely to get the death penalty compared to white defendants. Also, of course, if you can't afford a lawyer, you're probably more likely to get the death penalty compared to someone who can afford a lawyer. So it is a problem nationwide, not just in Texas, that minorities disproportionately end up on death row. We also have problems with the fact that, historically speaking, at some point we've executed someone who was actually innocent. Between 1989 and 2014, 1,064 people were released from prison nationwide because of DNA tests that exonerated them. The odds that an innocent person will be executed have gone down because of more reliable DNA testing. But it does still happen. There was a prisoner in Georgia named Troy Davis who was convicted of murdering a police officer based on eyewitness testimony. Let me explain something about eyewitness testimony. It is notoriously unreliable. If I took all three of you outside and I pointed to someone walking across the parking lot, you may get three different descriptions of this person. And the witnesses who said they could identify Troy Davis supposedly saw him 50 yards away at night in the dark. Yeah, good luck with that. But he was still executed. Even though one of the eyewitnesses recanted, he was still executed. So that's a problem. And juries don't understand necessarily that eyewitness testimony isn't that reliable. They tend to be like, oh, well, they saw that person clearly, not necessarily. In Texas, between 1989 and 2014, 49 prisoners on death row were exonerated. You can't give someone back 20 years of their life if they're wrongly convicted. It's even worse if you execute someone who's innocent. You can't bring Troy Davis back from the dead, right? You can't make up for the fact that an innocent person was in all likelihood executed. You can't undo that damage. And there was an interesting case in 1999 where a man named Cameron Todd Willingham was convicted of setting his house on fire and killing his 3 children. He was told he could take a plea deal and take life in prison, but he was like, I didn't do it, so he got the death penalty. Jailhouse witness who said he'd confessed to the murder later recanted, saying he was told he could get a lighter sentence in exchange for his testimony, and the forensic evidence was faulty. Another thing potential jurors do not understand is that the science is not always accurate. Fire science in particular is an area that's very complicated. There have been cases where someone's convicted of starting a house fire that kills someone, and then later forensic technology shows, no, actually that fire wasn't set on purpose, it was accidental. There's still issues with forensic evidence and forensic analysis. For example, they talk about cadaver dogs, right? How cadaver dogs can pick up the scent of a body. Sort of. They pick up on the scent of a human. Doesn't necessarily mean there was a body in that location. It's tricky. And a lot of the time, jurors don't really think about what that expert is saying. It's like, oh, they're an expert in science and fire technology, so of course they're going to be right. But despite the forensic evidence that wasn't quite accurate, and the eyewitness recanting, the state still executed Cameron Todd Willingham in 2004. And in all likelihood, the fire was accidental or something happened and he didn't deliberately kill his children. It's problematic because there's a lot of different factors that go into a death penalty case that aren't necessarily being properly looked at. There's a lot of questions about the technology and how reliable it actually is. So it gets a little tricky, to say the least. Okay. I'm going to show you a clip from YouTube. Eric, I'm going to put the link in the comments so you can watch it on your end. Because it's been a little problematic with trying to record YouTube on the Blackboard Collaborate, so I'm not going to share the screen on here. I'm just going to share it in the classroom. You can watch that on your end if you want. This is John Oliver. Some of you may be familiar with him. He was on The Daily Show, and now he has his own show on HBO, where he talks about issues in America, and one of them he likes to talk about is, why are judges elected? Hopefully this will work.
Judges, whereas of America's only formal means. Judges occupy an exalted position in American life, but as important as they are, we tend not to think about them very much, unless one of them makes news, as happened earlier this month. A federal court last month lifted Alabama's ban on same-sex marriage, but Roy Moore, the state Supreme Court Chief Justice, ordered state judges to ignore the federal ruling. Yes, Alabama Judge Roy Moore refused an order to let gay people marry, living up to his state slogan, Alabama, boldly refusing to accept diversity and the inevitable since 1819. So just out of interest, what was his judicial reasoning for such a decision? I think that gay marriage is an alteration of the definition of marriage. The United States Supreme Court does not have the authority, or the federal courts do not have the authority to interpret the word that speaks the Constitution. Hold on. Not only can the Supreme Court override a state, that's basically its job. That's like telling Dill it can't ruin any good stuff it comes into contact with. That's what Dill does. Get out of everyone's food, Dill. You're filthy weeds, you wrecking ball. You might be thinking, how did that man get to become the highest judicial officer in the state? Well, like 85% of state judges in America, he was elected. 39 states hold elections for judges, and America is virtually alone in doing this. There's only one other country on earth that does it on this scale. You can guess which? Wrong, it's Bolivia. A country you think about so little, you haven't even realized that's not Bolivia. This is Bolivia. Actually, that's still not Bolivia. This is Bolivia. Or is it? This game is never not going to be fun. Now, America has been elected judges since the early 1800s. The thing is, it all began with good impulse.
Initial elections originated as a reform measure, so people were concerned that judges were being selected behind closed doors. There wasn't any kind of public accountability.
Okay, and public accountability sounds great. The problem is, for many judges nowadays, there's almost none of that. Most run unopposed. Last year in LA County, 150 out of 159 61 incumbent judges ran unopposed. And come on, they could at least go through the motions of pretending there was another candidate. Just throw a robe on a pelican and tape a gavel to his lip. Or I'll tell you what, you're in LA, just pretend you're considering Blake Lively for the job. Movie studios do that all the time. And the problem is, whenever a judge does face a challenger, they have to run like a politician. That's why many states are subjected to the bizarre spectacle of ads like these.
Hi, I'm Alan Lawford. I'm running for our Supreme Court. It's Lawford because in law and free. This is my house. Come on in. Here's the kitchen. Something smells good. My wife Kelly Lawford. Our son Justice Lawford. Justice Lawford.
Yep, I call my son Justice, I call my dog Preamble, and I call my penis the Gavel. And sometimes campaigns opt to sell a judge with sheer catchiness.
There's a judge we call Paul Newman. He's got criminals on the run. He was there, got him scared, and you'll take on that. Paul Newman, he's a judge. Respected everywhere. All new me, justice tough but fair. All new me, criminals best beware.
What just happened? Am I supposed to vote for that man or root for him to catch their Duke boys? Look, I know what you're thinking. Could any commercial be less relevant to a judge's qualifications for the job? I give you Greg Beard.
Search and rescue in Rapides Parish. Here's volunteer diver Greg Beard.
That's not what we're doing. Study, train, trust our team. We do this because it helps people.
Greg Beard, Rapides Parish District Court Judge.
When times are tough, it's got team stands ready.
Of course, it makes sense. So when I'm choosing a judge, the only thing I really care about is who can hold their breath the longest. Here's the thing, all three of the men in those ads won their elections. They're judges now, judging people. And the stupid ads are actually the least problematic. It's far more worrisome when judges run ads like these.
Without blinking an eye, Judge Kenneth Ingram sentenced him to die.
Michael Oster is the only candidate for judge who has put our worst criminals on death row. My privilege is that
Well, it's your privilege. At best, it's your duty. There are some jobs where that kind of occupational relish is inappropriate. If you're having a colonoscopy, you don't want to hear, "It is my privilege to insert the camera deep inside your anus." The problem with an elected judiciary is sometimes the right decision is neither easy nor popular. And yet, campaigns force judges to look over their shoulder on every ruling, because while political attack ads can be aggressive, judicial attack ads can be downright horrifying.
I was convicted of stabbing my victims with a kitchen knife.
Shooting my girlfriend, ordered the system for a shot. Sexual assault on a mom.
Now that's last night. Appeal Justice Thomas Kilbride's act.
For law enforcement orders.
Good luck getting back into whatever you were watching after seeing that commercial. Sheldon and his friends are going to have to get into some pretty wacky mishaps to wipe the memory of that away. Those evil shadows are saying, sounds awful, but here's the problem. None of those three men were actually set free by Justice Kilbride, but each facing merely questioned the legality of procedural points in their trials, which is a judge's job. There's no room in campaigns for nuance. That's why you don't see bumper stickers reading, "Justice is complicated, requiring the sublimation of our basic instincts," which, though difficult, is the only thing that separates us from the anarchy of beasts, Kilbride 2015. The danger is, though, ads like those get inside judges' heads to make them rule more harshly to protect themselves in the future. And the problem is, that does happen.
There's some academic studies that have suggested that judges do change their behavior. So, for example, in election years, if you look at judges' sentencing decisions, judges tend to be harder on crime.
That's terrifying. You shouldn't be sitting in a prison going, "How did you get 15 months for public urination?" "Oh, you know, it was October in an election year. I should have known what I was getting into." And it's not like appointing judges is the perfect system. We can all name one we don't like, and it's usually Antonin No. Or, in his more palatable form, a bulldog trestle sense of Elections are inherently compromised because campaigns cost money, and that money has to come from somewhere, which leads to the horrifying spectacle of judges hitting up lawyers for donations.
For attorneys like Jules Holzman, this is the most expensive time of the year. Election season is when lawyers like him have to dig deepest into their wallets. That's because every hour or so, they'll get a call from a judge's campaign looking for a contribution. It's very hard to say no. It's impossible to say no.
Judges asking lawyers to give them campaign money is the definition of a conflict of interest. Giving money to judges wouldn't be acceptable in a state fair squash throwing competition. Oh, really? Gladys gets first place? How much money did she give? I know that knobbly pile of shit is not the nicest squash you've seen this afternoon. It looks like the Johnny Green Giant's dick fell off, and everyone here knows it, Gladys. Everyone knows it. Sometimes, judges will even shake lawyers down after the election is over. Democratic Appeals Court Judge Jim Sharp sent a passive-aggressive email to a Texas attorney who had donated to his unsuccessful opponent. He said, "I trust that you will see your way clear to contribute to my campaign in an amount reflective of the $2,000 donation you made toward my defeat." Wink emoticon. And the fact that he's shaking him down isn't even a part of that email I find most offensive. It's the wink emoticon. I guess we should all just be glad he stopped short of going full wink emoji. Incredibly, judges can even target potential future defendants. As a Philadelphia traffic court judge candidate named Willie Singletary did at a biker rally.
I'm like a friend for the I need the money. I need the money. I got the stuff I can do. All
judges do this. Are there divorce judges going to IKEA's right now saying, "Look, I know some of you guys won't last. Who's got $50 for me? Have fun." It would be glad to hear that that judge is no longer on the bench. But it wasn't for taking those contributions, rather because he allegedly once showed cell phone pictures of his genitals to a colleague, an accusation that yielded a disciplinary hearing. His magnificent opinion featured the phrase "the judicial penis," and determined he had intentionally groomed his penis for photography. Now, that's not really relevant to the story that I'm telling right now, but I think you'll agree you have to know that. You deserve to know that. Look, it gets one step worse. One step worse, judges also frequently benefit from campaign money given by businesses with special interests. While they may claim that that doesn't affect them, multiple studies have suggested otherwise.
Look at the Ohio Supreme Court and ask the question of how often they vote for contributors who appeared before them. And the answer was overall about 70% of the time. And in the case of one justice, Terence O'Donnell, 91% of the time.
Justice O'Donnell says that there is no connection there, but the point is, he still said, sure, why not, in response to people who gave him money 91% of the time. The only other person who does that is Nicolas Cage. It's been a disaster, Nicholas. It's been a romp. It's been a disaster. And to be fair, many judges don't like this system. Even Ohio Supreme Court Justice Paul Pfeiffer said, "I never felt so much like a hooker down by the bus station in any race I've ever been in as I did in a judicial race." It does explain Pfeiffer's campaign slogan, "Justice for all, no kissing on the mouth though. I have to say something for the man I fall in love with." Increasingly, since Citizens United, PACs and super PACs are getting involved. In fact, remember the banjo ad? The one you're still humming in your head? That was sponsored by a PAC of the North Carolina Judicial Coalition, whose funders include businesses like R.J. Reynolds. Remember this one?
I was convicted of stabbing my victims with a kitchen knife.
Shooting my ex-girlfriend and murdering her sister in front of our child.
That is sponsored by something called Just PAC, whose donors include Coke Industries, the US Chamber of Commerce, and John Deere PAC. Yes, the people who make tractors also apparently help make judicial decisions for the people of Illinois. And look, when you have a system where judges are serenading with banjos, shake down lawyers for money, compare themselves to prostitutes, and live in constant fear of tractors, you have a problem. Because faith in a strong, independent judiciary is is essential for a civilized society. Without it, settling disputes either in thunderguns or via the purge. And I still can't work out how that thing works. Are there any rules? Are time zones a factor in the purge? Is the East Coast purge an hour before the purge central time? In which case, nobody tweets about it, it spoils it for everyone. Look, if we're going to keep electing judges, we may have to alter our idea of justice is. In fact, at the very least, to be a bit more representative, we should tweak the blindfolded lady holding scales, put a tip jar in her hand, and give her a big winking emoji for her face.
Yeah, see, now I love that video. I mean, yeah, it gets a little dirty because it's John Oliver and that's what he does, but he's right. When you think about it, right? I mean, yes, on the one hand, it's helpful to know that we can kick out a judge who isn't doing their job. On the other hand, Rogue Industries is one of the biggest conservative industries that poured hundreds of millions of dollars in campaigns. Should they be allowed to pour that kind of money into a state judicial race? You don't think so? Okay. On the one hand, Citizens United does give them the right to do so. Citizens United was the 2010 Supreme Court case that said in terms of free speech, corporations are people. So legally, yes, they can do so. They can spend as much money as they want because they're protected under Citizens United. The question is, should they? I get that it's a complicated question, so if you need a minute to think about it, go ahead. It's a tricky one. Maybe it's a little too esoteric. Let's switch gears and talk about something a little still complicated, but something that people do tend to have an opinion on. We do execute the most people in the United States. We lead the way in the most executions. So should we still have the death penalty? Go ahead.
My opinion is that from what I've learned, all depends on the time that a person is.
Okay. Sure. So do you mind providing an example or? Yeah. Okay. Sure. So
Depends on their time, how they were funded, and based on the evidence. The evidence is so clear. I mean, there's this guy, so many women, they found so many, everything, and why not? This is going to be people. And also, I feel like we should give them space, like, this bad person, right?
well, technically, rape isn't a crime that's death penalty applicable. It only applies to murder.
Let's not do it. Let's
Okay.
killing.
Okay.
Killing.
Yeah.
And there's just so much evidence provided that you really are like, yeah.
He enjoys it, like a Ted Bundy type person, or.
And like, why are people been in prison for such a long time? I feel like he's just taking that.
That's fair. Yeah.
But then I also feel like, who are we?
Sure.
in the middle. I'm in the middle, but
Sure.
people in the middle.
Yeah.
But yeah, there has been wrong with people.
Mhm.
Like you said, there was like
Mhm.
there's those that we know deserve the penalty.
Yeah. Like last year, I think it was in March or April, there was a killing of James Bird, and we'll talk more about that next week. One of the men was executed like 10 years ago, and the other one was executed last March. And by and large, the majority of people, when they talked to them, were like, yeah, good riddance to bad rubbish. So what they did was so horrifically awful that, I mean, fundamentally, I don't like the death penalty, but I looked at that and I was like, I don't really have a problem with this
I also think it
particular
depends
one.
on us individuals, like,
Yeah.
let's say we can work with someone, you obviously want that person, so do it.
Sure.
But then it's also like, I think I would also want them to suffer a lot longer and just be in themselves forever.
And it's why usually the opinion of the families of the victim aren't taken into consideration. But this can backfire because sometimes they'll say we don't want the death penalty and the prosecutor will still go for it anyway. So sometimes they'll look at it and sometimes they're like, we can't take this into consideration. I agree, right? If someone murdered my sister, I want to go after them myself. But there's a reason why we're not allowed to do that, right? There's a reason we're not allowed to make that decision. Yeah, yeah. It's not our right to decide the fate of someone. And that's where I think it gets complicated for a lot of people is the nature of the crime, right? If someone goes in and shoots a convenience clerk in the course of a robbery, do they deserve the death penalty? Maybe not, right? Because it probably wasn't their intention to commit murder that night. Maybe, I'm not saying that it's right that they did that, but there's a difference between deliberately going after and killing somebody versus shit goes sideways and then you end up killing somebody. I think for some people it depends on the nature of the crime. You kill someone in the course of a robbery, okay. You deliberately stalk and kill a woman because she rejected you, they're going to feel a little differently about that. You kill children and you're done. People are, that's just not, people are going to be like, no. Yeah, it is complicated. By and large, I don't support the death penalty. However, with the exception that sometimes I do think with serial killers, there's nothing we can really do with them, especially if they are true socio/psychopaths. If they have no empathy, if they cannot ever feel remorse for what they did. There's no rehabilitation at that point, right? You can't do anything to fix someone who doesn't care that they've killed 10 people. So with serial killers, I'm kind of like, yeah, maybe, but that's about the only exception for me to the rule. But that's me, right? Everyone's allowed to have their own opinion on the death penalty.
It's a little bit difficult because I personally think I have a second cousin who definitely stabbed a girl almost to death after a police thing.
Yeah.
I thought they were going to give her the death penalty because, and I always knew growing up with her, she was just not okay.
Yeah.
I just kind of, I want to go hang out with her, and move on with me, and then that this girl flirting with her boyfriend, like, and I was like, give her the freaking death penalty because what's going to happen? She's going to come out and she's going to do something's going to trigger her. What if she does this again and again and again? And I feel like, well, maybe they, not the death penalty, but they do need a lot of rehab.
Yeah.
So whatever's going on up there.
Yeah. And they have done some research on children who show psychopathic tendencies, and they're trying to see if they can teach these children empathy, because they can't feel it naturally, so they're trying to figure out if they can actually train them how to feel empathy. Because it's that lack of empathy that removes that obstacle of wanting to hurt people. So if they can somehow teach these kids empathy and overcome the natural lack of it, maybe they have a chance. Right? Maybe. I'm not saying it's definitive, but maybe. Maybe.
I think there is that fear, like, oh, we don't, you know, it's not gonna help.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, and there are times where you look at a case and it's so particularly awful and so particularly nasty and so particularly brutal that people will look at that and say, that was just so particularly awful. This person cannot be part of society anymore. We can't do this. They have to go. The other question that arises is, how do we humanely execute someone? In the U.S., we execute people largely by lethal injection, although in a couple of states you can ask to be executed via firing squad. Yeah. Yeah. It used to be electric chair, which was definitely cruel and unusual punishment. The problem we have with lethal injection now is the makers of one of the drugs, phenobarbital, aren't based in the United States, and so they've said to the U.S., we will no longer ship you the drug to carry out the treatment. The states have had to come up with another drug cocktail that will work in its place. I think it was here in Texas that a prisoner was executed using this experimental, not experimental, but not fully tested drug to carry out the execution. It did work, but it does raise the question of, if we can't get one of the drugs, does that mean we need to reconfigure the death penalty yet again? Also, just something to keep in mind, we are the only Western country in the world that still has the death penalty. Only one, yeah.
So let's say we use Michael Myers. Let's say we have like, there's a Michael Myers here in the valley, you know, would you, and they caught him, would you still be against the death penalty for some individual like that? Because I know there really is people like that out there.
Yeah, it's hard for me because emotionally I would want to take the bastard out back and shoot him myself. Intellectually,
Tried so many times.
yeah, well, that's true. Right? Yeah, I might not actually succeed.
Maybe not that part, just like the killing part, you know?
Yeah. Intellectually, I would say throw him in jail for the rest of his life and never let him see the light of day. In some ways, I do think that is a harsher sentence because if they are executed, then they no longer suffer. They no longer, are isolated from the rest of the world. I think it's a harsher punishment to lock them up indefinitely and throw away the key.
No visitors.
No visitors, yeah. For the worst of the worst, I would say put them in those death row type cells where they're locked up 23 hours a day and get 1 hour of exercise. They're not allowed to interact with other people and just leave them there. Yeah. Maybe not quite as bad as that, because I know solitary confinement can make people a little bit nutty, but yeah. Give them at least light and stuff like that. But yeah, for me, personally, I would lock them up and throw away the key. But
if there's overcrowding.
Yeah, see, that's the problem, right? Yeah. For me, that's the other part of the problem. So to be fair, people aren't executed right away. It's not like 2 days later they're executed. It can take 20, 30 years to execute someone because of the appeals process. Yeah, there have been people on death row who die of natural causes. Yeah, that's where it gets tricky. That's where it gets tricky for me. I'm against the death penalty in most cases because most of the time there's some underlying reason why it happened. Like the guy who stabbed his girlfriend or whatever, right? Obviously that's horrific, that's awful, that's brutal. Does he deserve the death penalty for one murder? I don't know. I don't know. This is one of those arguments where my head and my heart are divided on it.
Yeah.
And I think if I ended up on a capital punishment jury, I would have to look at it really hard and debate, you know, what would I really want to go with?
I think it's also hard to have like responsibility and
Yeah.
the problem is not really that's what they know.
Yeah, no, technically, well, not technically, legally, we can't execute someone with an IQ of less than 75. And usually, if there is a clear issue with mental health that can be brought up at trial, and that is something the jury can take into consideration. So if I was on a capital punishment trial jury, and the guy killed someone with a hammer, for example, but it turned out that he had traumatic brain injury, or he was bipolar, or something like that, I don't think I could give him the death penalty in that case. Because there would be underlying conditions that would have caused, you know. Although in that case, I'm not entirely convinced it would be a capital punishment case, because usually if there's a clear history of mental illness or something like that, they're not going to go for the maximum punishment. Because they know, like, brain is tricky, right? And if someone was clearly showing signs of schizophrenia or traumatic brain injury or something like that, then they're probably not going to go for like the harshest sentence in that case. If I had a case where a guy, I don't know, walked into a senior care facility and just started murdering people, I don't know. I would have to think about that. I'd probably be that one juror who's holding up the process and typing at their test, but I'd have to think about it. I'd be that one arguing with them backward. But it's a complicated question, and there's no real clear answer for most people.
Also from a religious standpoint, it's like, you aren't God, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, the Catholic Church does say we shouldn't execute people, and for some people that is enough of an impetus to be like, all right, religiously I can't do this. It's tricky. It's tricky. But at least we no longer execute people who were under 18 when convicted, because they found that the brain doesn't fully develop until at least 21. We don't execute people who were mentally ill at the time of the crime or have an IQ of less than 70. We're getting better about it. We're getting better about it. I don't know if it'll ever be fully banned in this country, but we may reach the point where maybe it's like just serial killers or repeat offenders who end up on death row and not most crimes. I don't know. We're still better compared to countries like Saudi Arabia, where they execute people in public with a sword and chop off their heads. And in France, up until the 1970s, they used a guillotine. Yeah. Yeah. That'll blow your mind, right? In India and Pakistan, it's death by hanging. Yeah. Japan, I think it's hanging. They don't execute people that often. And in some countries, they still execute people by stoning them to death, which is incredibly barbaric, inhumane, cruel, and don't even get me started on that. So we're better than some countries, and at least we take into consideration certain factors before applying the death penalty. So we are better than we were 50 years ago, even on the death penalty. So who knows, right? I think we're getting better about making sure we're not executing someone who could be innocent, and that we're not, I don't know, overusing the death penalty, I guess. There are some states that don't allow it. Connecticut banned the death penalty. Illinois has banned the death penalty. California, there's a moratorium on the death penalty. Massachusetts, I think there's a moratorium on the death penalty. So there's some states that said we're not executing people anymore. But it's us, Georgia, Florida, and a couple of other states that still routinely carry out executions. but we're number one. So take that with a grain of salt. Okay, next week we're going to talk about civil liberties and civil rights issues. We're going to talk about one of the worst hate crimes in modern history in Texas, the murder of James Byrd Jr. I believe next Wednesday we're supposed to talk about the election, but if we don't know who won, or we don't know much about the election, I'll change it so we watch a documentary about what happened to James Byrd Jr. because it was horrifically awful. So read chapter 10 for Monday. Remember your papers are due 2 weeks from today, so make sure I get them. If for some reason the Dropbox isn't working on Blackboard, just let me know, and I'll try to reopen it. If you've already submitted your paper, that's fine. I still probably won't look at them until most of the papers have come in. If you have submitted your paper and you're like, crap, that's not the one I wanted to submit, if you can't resubmit it, let me know and I'll fix it for you. Okay? Any questions on the paper? Everyone's good? Okay. Awesome.